Welcome back to another episode of Write, Publish, Connect. My name is Alexa Nazzaro, founder of the Aaxel Author Group, and today I'm speaking to another one of the authors we have had a pleasure to work with. I am pleased to introduce you to Joseph Bolton, the author of Old Grandmother's Tree, a 2-volume folktale treasury that I'm going to let him describe a little bit more for you. Thank you so much, Joseph, for joining me today.
Oh, thank you, Alexa. I'm really happy to be here. So as you mentioned, yeah, Old Grandmother's Tree in its form right now is a 2-volume set. It's 40,000, it's a massive book, actually. It was a 4-year project. 40,000 words, over 450 full color illustrations throughout the stories, 10 stories that are interrelated across both of these volumes. And it was a 4-year project. Interestingly enough, when I started, I really didn't have a vision of what this book would become.
So why don't we start with, because every author, every book starts with a vision, starts with a spark. And this endeavor of yours is also really close to your heart because obviously it has relevance to your own heritage, and we'll get into that. So why don't you tell us, how long ago did you start this? Because very often, especially with a massive project like Old Grandmother's Tree, it's not something you do in a year or two. It can be right. So I know you mentioned 4 years. Why don't you give us a little bit more detail about how did this start and what was your initial vision?
Well, when I started to learn French and research my own French Canadian heritage, um, I wrote a short story um, trying to write in French with a little bit of help with Google Translate and stuff like that. But anyway, it was a cute story about my great grandparents' farm in Quebec. And at midnight, the farm animals sneak out of the barn, grab the toboggan, and go sliding down the hill. And my great grandmother comes up the hill at first chastise the farm animals, but at the end decides to go ahead and hop on the toboggan with them and slide on down. It was a cute little story, and I had it illustrated because I'm very much a visual person. I like to see that, and so I worked with an artist to have it illustrated. One of the first decisions we made was we made the shawl that my great grandmother Delia was wearing the same color as the Northern Lights. We put that in the sky as well. And that little detail became kind of a thread that helped create other stories because around the same time I had researched my family tree, I discovered an ancestor in Trois-Rivières named Mitio Goku. And she was a young Algonquin woman. Her life was fairly well documented by the Jesuits at the time. But but when she was 22 years old, she lost her husband and her 2 children in a raid by the Mohawks. And so she lost everything. 5 years later, she married again, a French settler named Pierre Cauc, and together they became my ancestors. And as it turns out, they were the ancestors of my great grandmother in the story, the first story I wrote. So then I kind of, from there, I went backwards and I told her story as at first it was just going to be a short little um, prequel to the main story, the farm in Quebec. But one thing I realized as I wrote more stories, and more details came up because characters, I think, take on a life of their own. You realize that they have backstories, they have motivations. And so that kind of tension and turmoil helps generate other stories. So from
So
there, yeah, go ahead.
So I wanted to ask you because I know you added stories. It was
Yes.
always, every once in a while, hey, Alexa, you know what? Over the holidays, I thought of another story and I thought of another story. So how do you, when did you know when to stop? What I mean by that is, as a writer, we're always diving back into our work. It's a very, very normal part of the process. What was it other than perhaps me trying to rein you in? What was the decision on your end to say, you know what, I think this is good?
Well, I think it was just getting physically and organizationally, it was getting more difficult to manage. I was working with two artists. I had a storyboard artist who kind of like paved the way and mapped out how the stories were going to go through the book. And when you have a book this large, you need someone like that to kind of be the planner. So this is where we're going to put these illustrations, and this is what's going to look like. And then I worked with another artist who finished the book, Natasha Pelly Smith. She's out of Toronto, and she did the next layer and finished these illustrations. So I'm working with three people. I'm working with you on trying to keep to get these stories edited and kind of polished a little bit like that. So there were a lot of moving parts, and this book was getting so big. I had to stop, and I wanted to see it. I wanted to physically hold it in my hands. And I was like,
Yeah.
okay, at this point we had to stop. And I think we actually did a mock book. It was interesting. We did a mock book and a book, and we first realized that it was too large for
Yeah.
Amazon. And that's
Yes.
why we had two volumes.
Right. So you were mentioning just now that you were working with two illustrators. Did you know from the beginning that you would be working with one strictly for the storyboard and another one to actually do the illustrations? What was that? How did you come about? How did you decide on that process?
I kind of stumbled into it out of necessity at first, but it
Okay.
evolved perfectly. The first artist I was working with, I did the first story,
Mm-hmm.
was a young woman named Masami Kyoto, and she works as a storyboard artist for commercials in Manhattan. And she did it. She loves doing storyboards. She loves doing that, but she does not like doing getting knee deep into the full illustrations. So she said, I can't do this. I can't do
Okay.
this. And so I had to go find another artist.
Okay.
And it turned out when I did a search for an artist, and I was looking for someone in Canada specifically because the books are set in Canada. And that's how I found Natasha. And it turns out Natasha doesn't really like doing the planning. She would rather just take the basic illustrations, the starting point, and be more creative and expressive that way. But the actual mechanics of planning this through, she does not like. So
Interesting.
they both were willing to work on it, but they both worked on the way they complemented each other very well. So
Interesting.
in looking back on it, if you have a project if you were going to try to do an illustrated book that's about 450 illustrations, as large as this one, you really do need two artists because if you had one artist trying to do both roles, you would burn that
Mm-hmm.
person out. And and then and then the project would take longer and it would just drag
Mm-hmm.
on for a long period of time.
I was going to ask you about whether this is something you recommend. Do you, because we work with a lot of children's authors. Admittedly, your book is quite unique in terms of its scope, in terms of the page count, but generally, do you think it's a good idea for authors to look at a storyboard artist and then having an actual illustrator?
I think it really depends on the length. If
Okay.
you're going to write a typical children's book of maybe a length of 30 pages, you probably don't need
Mm-hmm.
to do that.
Okay.
Um, but if you are going to do something larger or you're going to do a series, it's just really the size. Then you
Interesting.
probably would want to have a storyboard artist because with Masami, and in fact, I'm working with on follow-on stories, Old Grandmother Tree, with her right now. It's very easy for us to make design changes and to come
Mhm.
up with the concepts together and work to do that. And it saves a lot of wear and tear on more creative artists who would like to actually do the expressive work. So
Okay.
yes, definitely if it's based on size, if you're going to do a larger series of books, then I would definitely recommend a storyboard artist.
And what about if because I know obviously with your collection, the stories are all connected. What about somebody who's just doing an anthology of distinctly different stories? Do you still think that storyboarding process can be helpful?
I think it depends. If you intend to have the same artist do all the stories, then I would say that yes, yeah, you
Mhm.
probably should have a storyboard artist
Right.
because again, the same issues come in there. You're going to burn a person out if they have to do all those steps of the creative process. But if
Yeah.
you're doing an anthology, if you have different writers, you could very well have different illustrators for each
Hmm.
story.
Hmm.
And that becomes something that kind of a creative decision. And actually, I think it probably would be, probably would work. So I
Right.
think it really depends what your concept, but if interrelated stories, you definitely want to have a common theme, visual theme
Hmm.
throughout the stories. I would recommend that you have a storyboard artist to do kind of plan the visuals throughout the book.
Remind us again how many illustrations you have in total.
It's, I think I tried counting them. Excuse me. I tried counting them, and I think there's like over 450.
Yeah, I was
And
going to guess something like that.
yeah, and it's a lot of work. A lot of work
Yeah,
has to go into creating each one.
right.
It's like if you were watching someone doing a mosaic on a wall
Hmm.
and they had to do each piece of glass and it adds
Yeah.
up to a beautiful picture. It's the same thing with a large number like this. Each illustration is like almost like a little mosaic, creating this
Hmm.
beautiful visual story that
Hmm.
spans over the two books.
And what was the timeline looking like for you in terms of when you had a story? Let's just look at any given story between the
Mhm.
storyboarding and finishing the illustrations. What span of time are we looking at for you?
Well, I think, for me to write my initial draft, I could probably have an initial draft done in 2 days. I think that a story will come to me all at once and it'll be kind of welling up within inside me as I have this visual and stories come to me like as if a movie, I can see it visually before more than the words. And so immediately I write it down. I get that first draft and then I look at it a little bit and have somebody read it. And then when I think it's really great, then I send it off to you to take a look and to polish and give me some advice. And I think that's important. And that's been a very important part of the process for me. When I look back on my earlier writings and I look at what I'm writing now, I can definitely see your influence, Alexa, as a writing coach, and that I've become a much better writer. Um, Through working through your coaching and helping bringing my style to its full potential.
Okay, cool. And then what about the illustration part of that? So once you're ready, so you start with the storyboard all the way through to those final illustrations. I mean, we're talking months. I know that.
It does take months. I would say that storyboarding I'm working on a story right now, and the story is not in the book, 12,000 words, and I'm estimating 100 illustrations for that particular story.
Yeah.
Masami believes that she can get it done in 2 months. I think that's a little optimistic.
Okay. All right.
I think when Natasha finally gets a hold of it, it could probably take 9 months to get all
Yeah.
those done, 100, if she's moving at a steady pace. And you have to
Yes.
factor in corrections.
Yeah.
Sometimes she has to take a step back and take a break and work on other projects.
So
So
patience is important
patience
in an
important.
endeavor like that.
Yes, yes, it
Yeah.
is. Yes, it
Yes.
is. And you mentioned about how unique this book is. I think it's really a hybrid between like a book with a couple illustrations, maybe an illustration at the beginning of a chapter,
Mhm.
and a full-blown graphic novel. It's not quite a graphic
No.
novel,
Hmm.
but it's much more than just a single illustration here and there. The illustrations are like one half of the lungs of the whole
Hmm.
story as the story breathes. The text and the illustrations work very closely
Yeah.
to tell the whole story together.
So I wanted to actually ask you about that because most books, it's pretty straightforward how to classify them. This is a memoir. This is science fiction. This is historical fiction. Your book really, I would say, really blends. You mentioned the word hybrid, and I would also I say that that applies to the genre as well. It has a certain,
Mhm.
it doesn't really necessarily apply to one strict specific readership. So when you describe this book to people, because this is something I always tell authors, you have to have your pitch ready. How do you, in a nutshell, explain the essence of Old Grandmother's Tree?
Well, the first thing I would say is that it's an original folk tale, which in a way it's kind of a contradiction because folk tales are something that is in a traditional culture, have existed for hundreds, or even roots of them go back thousands of years. But original stories,
Yeah.
okay, so it's their original. And what I mean by that is that these stories are written in a folklore style,
Hmm.
but there's elements of truth in here. So I've taken the stories of my real ancestors, real people, and other characters in the books are also based on real people who lived in Quebec. And I've immersed them in kind of a magical folklore version of Quebec that has magic in it, has ancient Native American trickster animal characters from Native American mythologies in North America. And so I know that people have written, people write historical fiction of their ancestors before. That's very common. Well, this is not, it's kind of like that, but it really isn't either because it's
Yeah.
not perfectly, true. Or they wrote pure fantasy stories. So it's a blend of both. It's taking reality and it's taking real people, real story, and immersing it into a world of magic and then kind of stirring it around and then seeing what
Mhm.
happens. So it
And,
is
and
very hard to categorize it.
yes. And how is it, how is it when you talk to people about this? Because it is such a unique book. What is the reception like? And what I mean by that is not so much do they go out and buy the book, but do they find that intriguing? What is that general reaction?
I think that if I describe it verbally and I don't have the book with me,
Hmm.
people are kind of confused
Okay.
because it isn't categorized
Right.
very easily. And that is actually one of the challenges of marketing this book. It
Hmm.
doesn't fit into Amazon's little categories. But if I describe the book and I actually have a physical copy of the book,
Hmm.
um, and show them, then they get it. They get it
Yeah.
right away. People
Yes.
love this book once they hold it in their hands
Yeah.
and they see the quality of the work that you and I, and all the people, it's a team effort. We all put into creating these books.
Hmm.
And I think they fall in love with it. And then they
Yeah.
start looking at the illustrations and they fall in love with the story.
Yeah.
Then they get it. So
Right.
I think it's something that can't be described. It's a book that has to be held in your hand and you
Interesting.
have to look at it.
So you would recommend authors who have these types of books, because we work with authors who also do coffee table books or journals, books that really have a strong visual element. It's always good, I guess, to have a copy with you when you're explaining the book to
Yeah,
people.
yes. In fact, a lot of places I go, I have copies of the book with me.
Yeah.
And I have little business cards, has some of the illustrations on the back of the business cards, which is nice. But I sometimes when I go to church, I've
Yeah.
even I go to a French Canadian parish in Leominster, and I have the book sometimes with me in the pew just to sitting there. And if somebody
Perfect.
asks me, sees them and gets curious and asks me, I'll engage them in conversation. And a lot of times I give a book. I know you're probably going to think you're crazy to do this, but I've actually given away a lot of books because I figured that was the best way to advertise these books, is to get
Yeah.
them in the hands of people who would appreciate them and then tell other people about them.
Right.
And so yeah, the books can become your best marketing tool is the actual
Sure.
book itself.
Yes, absolutely. And just in terms of marketing, one of the other things that I know you have done is you've really reached out to different communities, specifically Indigenous communities in Canada, in Quebec. What has that been like? Because most authors, they think, okay, I have to get this book in the hands of readers. I'm going to start Amazon campaigns. I'm going to do this and that. And that does not negate the validity of any of those efforts. But I know that for you, and I think it's very relevant given the nature of your books, these two volumes, that you've really built some alliances in some perhaps unlikely or non-traditional places. So going out and connecting with these other communities, what has that been like?
It's been a real adventure. And I think personally rewarding to make these connections. And probably the biggest one you mentioned, because Mitio Goku was an Algonquin woman in Canada, I decided just to kind of Google up Algonquin communities in Canada. Said, I'm just going to reach out to them. And I did that. I found a community up in Pembroke, Ontario, which is like a little bit kind of northwest of Ottawa, maybe about 2 hours drive. And I reached out kind of a cold call and said, hey, this is who I am. I'm Joe Bolton, and I'm descendant of this Algonquin woman named Mitio Goku, and I wrote this great book about her. And I actually sent the director of the Pembroke, Ontario book community, I sent him that mock book, that big,
Yeah.
thick mock book that had all the stories in it. And I said, tell me what you think. And
Yeah,
he really liked it. And he
cool.
passed it on to other organizations up there. That culminated with a great visit I did back in November with the community, meeting actually community leaders, and we talked about the books. And I was really touched by the warm reception I
Nice.
received. And they're helping to promote the books up there in Pembroke. And I plan on returning this summer
Cool.
when the next book is done.
So why give us, if you had to give authors one tip for doing similar outreaches, so obviously they're not necessarily going to be reaching out to indigenous communities, but other types of community organizations, what would be the one piece of advice you would give?
I think you have to make personal connections. You have to do this on your feet. You
Mhm,
have to get in your car and you have to drive and you actually have to go to the people that you want to meet in person.
mm,
And I would set expectations with people is that if you are going to make any progress in what's an immensely crowded market,
mhm,
you have to put a lot of time and a lot of work into it. And you have to make those personal connections. I have gone to libraries and actually handed the book. And at first, you get a little bit of pushback from a library because they get a lot of books from, hey, look at me, I'm a self-published author, and here's this book. So you have to make that personal connection. So that's the important thing. You have to make personal connections. You have to spend the time doing that. And I think you have to consider as part of your marketing budget is to
mhm.
actually say, I'm going to give books away to key influencers and get the books in the hands of them, like libraries and bookstores. And I've been kind of slowly building it up. I think I've got in the New England area, I've got the book in like 5 different libraries and 3 different bookstores so far. So it's a
Nice.
small start, but each
Yes.
one of those I had to make a direct connection with.
Mhm. Okay. And what can we look forward to in the, I know you're working on other stories, so I know you also had to recover a little bit after the first 2 volumes, just because I mean, look, we go through creative burnouts. It's completely normal, or we just have to step back and refill the well, as I call it, is just refilling that, if you will, for creativity. Um, what are we looking at for the future?
I think the future is great for the Old Grandmother Tree series. I have, in various stages of completeness, I have 3 stories of the work. The first story that's going to come out next is going to be worked on, and you've seen this, is the dance creation. And what it is, it's both a prequel and a sequel to Old Grandmother's Tree. It's a sequel in the sense that the story begins as a framing story where an Algonquin grandfather in Pembroke, Ontario, as in tribute to my new friends in Pembroke, Ontario, um, he and he is telling the story of the creation, the mythology of the creation of the world of inside the Old Grandmother's Tree universe. Same characters. Like, where did these trickster animals come from? But what makes it kind of interesting, framing story unique and why it's a sequel is because the framing story is set 100 years in the future. And the grandfather is himself a descendant of Mitio Goku. So the story is kind of a prequel, but it's also, I mean, a prequel in the sense it talks about the beginning of the world, but it's also a sequel in the fact that we're talking about 100 years from now. And I really like that idea because I think it tells the reader that you are immersed in the story. The story is a living thing that's happening right now. You're in the middle of it. It's behind you, but it's still in front of you. It's still unfolding. So you are inside, you are part of it. So that's one story. The next story I'm working on, and I've just started with the storyboarding, is All Around You There Is a Light, and it talks about the last couple of days of Michio Goku's life. And I'm very excited about that's going to be an epic story. It's really going to be very incredible. And she's going to be telling her life story to her granddaughter. And then the story after that I started is about the LaRue girls. We left them off in volume 2, the LaRue twins. They were children out there in the eastern townships of Quebec, teenagers, and their family is packed up and they're moving to Whitehorse on a big adventure. So I've already wrote about their adventures as they take a train ride across Canada and the frontier back in 1903 in Canada, and the characters that they meet. And then eventually into Whitehorse and the adventures they're going to have with different characters. And what also is going to be uh, interesting about that one is that I have that story is being told by one of the LaRue girls' great granddaughters in Whitehorse.
Oh,
8 years
nice.
from now, it's set in 2032, and so the trickster animals are there as well. So again, I like that idea of moving the time setting connection around the reader, so you feel like
Yeah,
you're inside the story. It's not something distant; it's part
yeah.
of around you.
Very
So
cool.
those are
Very
the three
cool.
books I have.
Well, you definitely obviously have a lot of passion, and I think that's so critical. And I think you're an excellent example of that, Joseph. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences with these two very special volumes. And I look forward, and the whole Aaxel Author Group looks forward to working with you on these future books. Thank you so much,
Thank you, Alexa.
and all the best in your future endeavors.
Thank you.